Hello and welcome. To use a cricketing analogy, the Indian monsoons opened with a bang and with a very high run rate, with a lot of fours and sixes being hit. But slowly the run rate slowed down to the point that now the entire match looks like it might not go in the home team's favor. Now let's come back to what we're really talking about. The monsoons have not been very good. The CRISIL report, the rating agency CRISIL, says that as of 23rd August, rainfall was about 9% below the long-term average, and that's something that we should be worried about. It also says that there are other concerns about the manner in which rainfall has arrived this time and has dispersed across the country. And also, interestingly enough, the reservoir levels are lagging long-term trend. Now, remember that some of us, particularly living in cities like Mumbai, have been exposed to very high intense periods of rainfall and somehow have formed an opinion or a impression that there has been a lot of rainfall in a short period of time everywhere. Clearly now, as the data is coming in, that's not the case, and definitely that's not sufficient enough to keep the agricultural economy as humming and vibrant as it should be, though the numbers again there are not a concern right now. But let's understand in some more detail what's happening and why this is happening, and what this means most importantly when it comes to impact. So to discuss that, I'm joined by rating agency CRISIL's chief economist DK Joshi. DKG, thank you very much for joining, and always a pleasure to speak with you. So tell us, what are these data points telling you, and do you agree that it also conflicts in some ways with a commonly held impression that actually we've had very high intensity rain so far?
Well, I think those sitting in Mumbai might be thinking that, but I think those living in Gujarat, Odisha, I think, and even Punjab for that matter, though Punjab has a decent irrigation buffer, they would think differently. And I think so that's the point. I mean, that the overall deficiency is 9%, which means that the rains have been 9% below the long period average, which is essentially the average of last 50 years of precipitation. I think what has also happened is that the monsoons covered all India with a lag of almost 5 to 6 days. It was supposed to cover all India by July 8, I think, as happened last year, but I think it got stretched. So that led to some delays in sowing. But I think what's really interesting is that because I think there were bouts of good rain, I think July we saw bouts of good rain and bouts of deficiency. So the sowing picked up, I mean, quite significantly during when it rained. And right now, I think the sowing levels are normal, I would say. I think as the last 5 years average, if you take that to be normal, I think they are at those levels, slightly below what was the kind of sowing we saw last year. I think so I think the other interesting part is that what does it mean for economy? What does it mean for other parameters? I think which we can talk about.
Right. Okay. So just to build on that, on the states and different places faring differently. Gujarat, according to your numbers, Mr. Joshi, is 47% below normal. Orissa is 31% below normal, and Punjab 20% below normal at this point. Now, this has to be seen in the context of their combination or the combined output and production of food grains plus pulses plus oilseeds, and the fact that only Punjab has a very high irrigation cover, which obviously counterbalances the irregular rainfall, whereas Gujarat and Orissa, for instance, have much lower irrigation cover. So so Gujarat, Orissa and Punjab account for 4.6, 2.8 and 9.5% of crop as measured here. So now this obviously gives us another angle as to what is happening in terms of the way rainfall is dispersed. Now tell us about reservoirs, and this number is again quite surprising, because your data seems to suggest that reservoir levels in many states are actually below what they were at this time last year.
That's right. And I think not only below this time last year, but what is regarded as normal, which is the average of last 10 years. And I think the only region which is where the reservoirs are overflowing, if I may say that, I think is the southern part. I think the southern part, except Kerala, has got reasonably good rainfall this year. The northern part is well irrigated, but I think the point is that the the reservoir situation being a little dim, though northern India doesn't have too many reservoirs, I think it doesn't augur well if rest of the season the rains don't play out well, then it becomes a concern. For all the other regions, eastern, western, and central, I think the reservoir levels are somewhat trailing. Now, if it rains pretty well in the rest of the season, I think you can make up for it. But as of now, I think it is something that needs to be monitored very closely. And I think particularly for those states where I think the irrigation buffer in general is low. I mean, you irrigate through your reservoirs. You also, I think, irrigate through other sources. I mean, particularly the northern part of India is protected because the sources are melting of ice water, etc., which lead to river and canal irrigation. But I think that's not true of the western and the southern parts. I think some of those regions. So I think there it would need to be observed. I mean, I won't say it's cause for alarm bells yet, but I think it's certainly something that you can't take for granted, so to say.
Right, and it is interesting that there are about 130 reservoirs that you've talked about here, with data coming in from the Central Water Commission. Southern India has 37 reservoirs, which are at about 82% of capacity. Currently, they were at 70% last year. In sharp contrast, let's say Northern India has only 8 reservoirs and is running at 47% storage capacity versus 55% at the same period last year. The 10-year average is 72%. So therefore, we have a clear problem when it comes to reservoir and storage, particularly because this is the water that goes onward to irrigate and also obviously gives you the buffer when rains fail. So the next obvious question, I guess, obviously is how is it going to impact the economy, both the agricultural economy as well as the larger economy, because a lot of people do live in the agrarian part of India, and their consumption usually acts as a buffer when other things don't. What's your sense, DK?
Yeah, I think, the relationship between overall rainfall, which is, I think, an average for the season, reservoir levels, I think, which we talked about, and the climate impact, I mean, sudden heat, I mean, these things also impact the crop output. If I were to give you an example of where I think you had deficient rains, but agriculture didn't look bad, I'll take the 3 years, 16-17 fiscal year. Rains were 3% below long period average, but agriculture growth was 6.8%. The next year, 17-18, rains were 5% below normal, but the agriculture was still 6.6% over a high base. 2018-19, rains were 9% below normal, but the agriculture growth was still 2.6%. So I think a number of things have to come together for agriculture output to be normal. Affected. But let me point out that I think and rainfall is one of the most critical ones. Unless the other factors are very favorable, I think the rainfall is very critical, not only from the irrigation aspect. It's also important from drinking water and many other things, I think, which the reservoirs feed into. So I think what we have taken on the basis of historical linkages between rainfall and output, we're going with an agriculture GDP forecast of around 3%, which is a little lower than the trend level, but I think is not alarming, so to say. And I think the problem is that what is happening in Gujarat and Odisha, the crops that they specialize in, I think the other regions have managed to sow more than I think they usually sow. So I think overall at the all India level, there's no deficiency in the sowing aspect. So if other parts do well, then I think you can be sure that agriculture output may not suffer much. And this is only about, by the way, Kharif right now. I think there is a Rabi season also. And I think what we are also experiencing in the last couple of years is that the horticulture crops are increasingly accounting for larger part of agriculture output. And horticulture doesn't get impacted that badly as the cereals, pulses, and other crops do get impacted. So I think many things are playing out right now.
Right, and the next big question obviously is how does it all impact the economy, particularly as we are now coming on the heels of COVID-19 and that impact on overall economy, economic recovery, jobs, incomes?
Well, I think agriculture still everybody is 15% of GDP, but employs more than 40%. So it's an important part of the economy. Now I think so. As I said, growing at 3% agriculture GDP is I think is cannot be considered abnormal or alarming by any stretch of imagination if that plays out. Now the second issue is what happens to inflation. Interestingly, I think the crops which seem to be hit to some extent, I think, are oilseeds, sunflower, and I think cotton, and even to some extent pulses, because pulses are largely grown in unirrigated areas. Now, government has reduced the customs duty on pulses, which is called lentils, so to say. And also on edible oil. So that will have some moderating impact on inflation, even if there is some issue with the output to some extent. So that's the inflation aspect. I think from the farmer's perspective, I think this year is a little different from last year. Last fiscal, food inflation was quite high. So, and the non-food was low. So what it means is what the farmer sells, he's getting a better price, higher price for that. And what he buys, it is not rising at that rate. This time, I think it's the other way around. I mean, the food inflation is still moderate. I think in the last 4 to 5 months, I think we've seen food inflation average around 4%. And what he's buying, which is whether it is healthcare or other things, has become expensive. So as a result, I think the terms of trade for the farmer are a little adverse this year. And also from a rural economy perspective, what we find is that the Narega spending is a little lower than last year. And I think the COVID wave was also more virulent in the rural areas. So if you put all these things together, I think the rural economy may do better than the urban in many respects, but I think it's not the boosters to rural economy are not as vibrant as they were last year. Let me put it that way.
Right. Now, as you look at all this rainfall data and the manner in which the dispersion is taking place, which itself is varying almost every year, the levels in reservoirs coming down, how do you project ahead? How are we as a country preparing, or should we be better preparing for this very important aspect of our lives, which is the monsoon and rains?
Well, I think you are absolutely right. I think the monsoons have become very volatile, so to say, and I think predictability is also coming down because of several factors, and one of them is climate change. And I think climate change is seen as something that's going to impact the agri economies pretty badly from a long-term perspective. So I think one is doing things to ensure that the damage from climate change is minimized, but that no one country can do. I mean, that's a global cooperation that will be required there. So that is one aspect. Rest, I think, is that we need to invest more on crops which can withstand lower water requirement. I think that's the R&D part of agriculture. And we also need to spread the coverage of irrigation as much as possible, ensure that the cropping pattern is right. I mean, we are not growing sugarcane in water, which is a water guzzler in rain deficient, in water deficient regions, as it happens in Maharashtra, or we are not growing rice in regions like Punjab, I mean, which again, I think is a water guzzler and is pushing the water table down. So you need to correct the cropping pattern. I think you need to take action on the global warming front. And I think you have to gradually stretch and depend on measures which save on water, like drip irrigation, etc., which is happening, but I think it needs to happen much faster.
Right, and finally, does this mean the overall macro GDP number are you seeing any changes there from what you projected earlier, given this, or are you still holding your earlier estimates?
No, we are holding our earlier estimates. I think I would say that monsoon is not that big a risk as of now to agriculture as the third wave can be. I mean, the virus is the most, I think, a big problem that we are, and it is creating so much of uncertainty. If we ride through the year with a milder wave, then I think we are okay. I think then there's no need to change our growth outlook of 9.5%. But if the third wave becomes virulent, or there is a new strain of virus which creates havoc, then I think we have another forecast which is 8% GDP growth, which is a pessimistic scenario.
Right. DK Joshi, Chief Economist of CRISIL, thank you so much for joining me, and look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.